Well, good afternoon, and welcome to Pay Entry's weekly webinar. I'm Kathy Graham. I'm head of the HR Services division at Pay Entry, and I want to welcome you this afternoon. Talk to you a couple of housekeeping things. If you notice, you have two handouts on your screen today for you. One is a copy of this presentation in PDF format. The other is a copy of an overview of all of the federal record-keeping requirements. We're going to go over a lot of this today, but it does give you some other supporting documentation if you want something to refer to. This webinar will be recorded, so it will be available after the fact if you'd like to access it. And I do hope you'll answer our survey at the end of this session to give us some more feedback on how well you liked it, maybe some suggestions for other webinars that you'd like for us to do. We throw this up here because we have to tell you that we're not attorneys, and this information is intended for educational purposes only. We hope that it's informative, but please don't construe it as legal advice. Okay, let's talk about managing your employee files. The questions we're going to answer today is, why do we keep employee records? It's not because we like to have stacks of documents around us, I know that. Who has access to employee files? Legally, basically. What should be kept in a separate file outside of the personnel file? What are the requirements for storing files? How long do I have to keep employee records, which is key here today? And can employees have access to their files? So I'm going to answer all of these questions today. However, if there is a question that I don't answer, please type it into the questions box. And at the end of this session, we will go over those one by one and answer your questions. All right, let's start out by, why do we keep employee records? Well, we first of all do it to comply with federal, state, and local laws. Primarily, the laws that we're going to be presenting today are federal, at the federal level, but there may be a state or a local law that impacts you. If you're not sure of that, please let us know. If you're in California, you just know that there is something else there that you have to comply with. Probably California, Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut right now, maybe even New Jersey. There may be some extra laws there. If you're in the South like I am, probably not. We also do it to maintain current personnel and personal information on each employee, and to be able to prove benefit enrollments, elections, and decisions that are made by the employee for the deductions that we take out of their checks. We also collect documents related to performance for decisions about pay and jobs, and we do it to stay organized. We also do it to be able to quickly respond to any audit request. We talked yesterday about Department of Labor audits in a webinar we held yesterday, and so if an auditor comes in, you want to have your files in such an order that they're not into everything. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Let's talk about compliance with federal, state, and local laws. So, what records do you have to keep? You have to keep records on selection, hiring, and employment. Things like job applications, resumes, job ads, and postings, even though those don't go into the employee file, when you run a job, you need to keep that information. Screening tools, interview notes, and references. We also look at records related to performance appraisals, training, and positions held by the employee. Also, if you have to comply with EEO-1 or EEO rules, then you're going to need to keep your EEO-1 forms that you file on an annual basis. So these are some of the things that are required. You also have to keep payroll records. This is very straightforward, and the Department of Labor is very interested in looking at these once in a while. You have to keep timesheets or time cards, basic employee data, the name, address, social security number, some other things. Date of birth, you normally don't keep that if you don't have to have that unless the person is under the age of 19, but most files do contain that information, on benefit documents and things of that nature. You must keep compensation records. Those are the amounts and the dates of payments. That also would be found in your pay entry system. Information on when the work week begins and ends. That should be stated in your handbook. It's also going to be in your payroll system. The basis and the rate at which wages are paid. So in your payroll system now, you have someone makes $10.50 an hour. That's the basis and the rate at which you're paying those wages for that person. You need to keep the dates of payment and the pay period covered, deduction information, wage garnishment orders, overtime wages paid, fringe benefits paid, and then total wages paid each pay period. You have to keep Form I-9 on each person after you hire someone. So within the first 3 days on the first day or before the first day of employment, the employee should be completing the first part of that, and then you complete the last part of it, and then make sure it's complete, put it in your file. You need copies of the documentation. Then you have to keep employee benefit records. You have to keep enrollment forms, any change forms, and beneficiary forms, which you should have updated every year during open enrollment to make sure that someone has the appropriate beneficiary on your records. I've known people that have divorced, remarried, and forgotten to change their beneficiary, and that doesn't really go over well when somebody passes away and the wrong wife gets the benefit. You also have to keep any forms related to employee inclusion in a retirement plan. That's very important. Retirement plans are audited probably more than, I would say, wage and hour. It's a very common audit for companies to have. So you have to have those records. Additionally, you have to have employee's full name and social security number, and this is back on the payroll. I think we already did some of this already. If they're younger than 19, sex and occupation, when their work week begins. Some people may begin work on a certain day of the week, but your work week as an employer and for pay purposes doesn't change. The hours worked, the total hours worked each work week, and the basis. I'm sorry, I think we already went over that, but now that you've heard it twice, you'll remember it, right? Their regular hourly or salary rate. You also have to keep background check information, tax records. That all is the tax records you would find in your payroll system. Attendance records, FMLA leave records, or any other state leaves that you have to, like Massachusetts and California, and New York and New Jersey all have paid sick leave. There are more states than that, but those are a few of them. So if you have states that do have a paid sick leave law, then you need to keep the documentation on that also. Information related to disability claims, including information on accommodations. You need to keep drug testing records and in-service medical testing records, like hearing, vision, and immunizations. A lot of manufacturing companies have regular hearing tests if there's a lot of noise in the plant so that they can make sure that the person is not being impacted. You need to keep military leave records, workers' comp leave records, all of these. So there's lots of things that HR people and payroll people collect. Now, what do you do with all that? So who has access to these files? The basic rule is that only those with a true need to know should have access. It is not necessary. That's why we're going to talk about separation of records. It's not necessary for a supervisor to see everything in an employee's file. Some of the files should only be seen by HR and top management. So what should be kept in a separate file? So these are the files where you need some separation. If you have employee benefit information, you want to keep that separate. It has protected health information on it that is protected under HIPAA, so it's very important for you to make sure that it is not in their personnel files. You need to keep medical records, such as drug testing and in-service medical testing, maybe immunizations. Keep that separate in a different file. FMLA records should be in a separate file. Once again, there's medical information on there if the reason for their leave is medical for themselves, and medical information for their family, which is not anyone else's business. Workers' comp records, I-9s, both the forms and the documentation, and I-9 forms should be kept in a separate folder, binder, or file electronically, so that if you ever have an I-9 inspection, all you're pulling is one file for an auditor to look over. You don't want your I-9 forms anywhere near your personnel files. Your disability record should be in a separate file. In fact, the law says if you're keeping a paper copy, it needs to be in a separate file cabinet so that a different key has to be used to access those records. That's under the Americans with Disability Act. So I-9s for all employees should be in the same file in case of an audit. I think I just mentioned that. So where should you keep employee records? Well, if you're storing paper in a locked file cabinet with key access to limited individuals, might even be in a locked file cabinet that's in a locked office. These are very important documents and very private. You need to have them in a separate drawer. So if you have HR files in a top drawer, just general HR files on subject matter, you don't want any personnel files in with that. They should all be separate. Separate any files that have medical information and all disability files. If you're filing electronically, they must be in a place where they're readily accessible for inspection or examination, so that you could pull one file with all the I-9 forms in it, or you can pull one person's medical file. Just make sure that it's easy to get to. Not that you're going to let the auditor sit down at your computer and access those, but you want to be able to access them quickly because you don't want the auditor to wait. And you must have strict security protocol in place for access, including passwords, I was going to say firewalls. Passwords and firewalls, your IT staff needs to be trained on if there are files that are protected by HIPAA, you should have IT trained on HIPAA protection of electronic files. So there's another level of security when it comes to electronic storage. And you must have a backup system in place. You don't want to have everything stored in your system and, God forbid, your system blow up and you don't have a backup. That would not be a good thing to have happen. So how long do you need to keep records? Well, here's a chart that shows you the type of record and how long. If it has anything to do with selection, hiring, and employment, you need to keep it 1 year after the person is terminated. Payroll records are kept for 3 years. I-9 forms are kept for 3 years after the hire date or 1 year after termination. I don't suggest you ever throw away an I-9 form. You just never know. You know me, I'm a pack rat. when it comes to how long to keep records. I think that if you keep it longer than required, you're probably better off. But this is the federal law that says you have to keep them exactly this amount of time. Employee benefit files, employee benefits are covered under ERISA law, and under ERISA, the files have to be kept for 6 years or as long as the plan is relevant. So if you have a retirement plan and you have participants in it, but it's shut down and those participants haven't accessed their funds yet, don't throw their files away because that plan is still active. And even if it were inactive, you could probably, I mean, there might be a lawsuit where you would need that information. So background checks, you keep a year. FMLA records, 3 years. That's right in line with the payroll records. Disability records for a year. Drug testing records for a year. If you're managed by the DOT or have to comply with DOT regulations, it's 5 years. And military leave files are indefinite. There's a much more extensive list of these of records and how long to keep them in the handout on your screen that's available to you. So can employees have access to their files? Yes. Employees are allowed to see their files. They have to request it in advance. Different states have different time frames for the request. Normally, the review takes place in the Human Resources office. But remember I said there are state laws that vary. So make sure you check your state for specific parameters. Okay. Always short and sweet, to the point, lots of facts. Let's see if we have any questions today. Anyone have a question? Okay. Here we go. We have one question about do DOT drug testing results need to be kept separate from their personnel file? Definitely. Yes. Please keep them in a separate file. Do verifications of employment need to be kept? If so, for how long and where? I would keep them as long as you keep your payroll records, so 3 years. Being as though medical records should be filed separate, does this include doctor excuses for missed work? If it has a diagnosis on it, yes, it's a medical record. If it doesn't have a diagnosis on it, then I would say probably from an attendance and record keeping standpoint, it's probably going to have something medical on it. So yes, I would keep it in a separate file. You could keep the benefits information and things like attendance records in the same file if you wanted to, because anything with medical information that's protected by HIPAA could be included together. Another question, what about garnishments? How long do those need to be kept and where? That would be according to the payroll record, and that would be 3 years. You would keep them with your payroll records. So is a question, should the I-9 be in both the personnel files and the I-9 file? No, they should just be in the I-9 file, not in the personnel files. Okay, any other questions? Those are all good questions. Another, do you have to have a manual W-4 in the file if the employee, did it online? You do not. You can file, it can be an electronic document. That's a good question. And it would be held for 3 years, like your payroll records. Now, if someone's still working for you and they've been there 10 years, you might not throw anything away from their file because you might need it. And there's another, not a question, but I thought employee files had to be kept for 7 years. No, it might be a company policy, but this is what the federal law states, or it could be a separate state policy that you have in your state, but federal regulations only require 3 years. Another question, workers' comp claims kept in medical or personnel? I would put them in the medical file or have a separate workers' comp file. Do we need to keep the documentation that's in pay entries onboarding in our business e-files, or is it okay to access this information from pay entry? It's okay to keep it in our system. It's safe there. We have tons of firewalls. We protect your data probably better than you could ever protect it. Another question, um, how long do we keep term employee files? Well, you would keep a payroll file, so the last year that they're there, you'd need to keep it for at least 3 years. Do benefit enrollments or changes have to be kept separately? Yes, they do. They should be kept in a benefits folder. There's a couple of questions here about the I-9 file, including the form of ID, maybe copies. Some companies don't do copies. They just record the document and they don't do that. Um, I think that from what I've heard, best practice is to keep a copy of the document in case you ever had to prove you actually saw it. If the person's long gone and someone comes in to audit, it is nice to show that you have a copy of the document, but I don't think that the law requires it. Okay. I think that's, oops, here's one. Is it okay to have the benefits election info with the medical files? Yes, it is, because it has the same type of protected health information. PHI is when anything that is related to medical benefit enrollment files are, that's kind of stretching it for me, but they are covered because they have a social security number on them. Sometimes they have the identifying features of an employee, their address and that kind of thing, and what kind of coverage they've enrolled in. So technically it is medical information. So I would keep it with the medical files, but not in the personnel files. So what should be in a separate HIPAA file? Anything that has anything to do with medical um, condition of the employee or their benefits from a healthcare standpoint. All right, I think that's it. So if you have other questions, please feel free to send me an email, and I will be happy to answer any of your questions after this or provide you additional information if you need more. So I appreciate your coming today. Hopefully it was beneficial to you. If you could fill out the survey that you're requested to complete at the end of this, that would be awesome. That gives us the feedback that we need to prepare for other webinars. So I hope you have a great rest of the day and hope to see you soon.